would now invite Shiranjan Aute to introduce Professor Chatterjee in a more formal manner. Yeah, Shiranjan.
We can't hear you.
Shiranjan, you have to unmute yourself.
No, sir, you are inaudible. नाही येते सर, आवाज नाही येते.
Shiranjan, please use headphones.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Very afternoon to all of you in VM. Actually, no need to introduce Professor Chatterjee to the students of this discipline and to anybody who is interested in South Asian studies. Professor Partha Chatterjee is a political theorist and historian, the founding member of Subaltern Studies Collective, and Professor Emeritus at Columbia University in New York. He has given new directions to the discipline of political science and paved a new way for new radical thinking about South Asia. His books, including The Politics of the Governed, The Nation and Its Fragments, A Possible India, Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World, are foundational texts for students of political science. Very few know that he is also a poet, playwright, and he has also acted in Meera Nayar's film Namesake and the role of reformed Hindu. I find the today's topic immensely important and timely. Professor Chatterjee will be speaking for a vernacular political science for this memorial lecture. We all are aware that we will be discussing this topic in the post-pandemic or post-lockdown scenario, when higher education in India is surviving a massive blow. Great number of students have been thrown out of higher education, and there are efforts from students and teachers to keep the discipline in a state university after Savitribai Phule's name. One interesting point I would like to add here, when I was informing about this lecture, one of my Marathi friends asked me, what is the meaning of vernacular political science? And immediately I translated it as Prantabhashik Rajyashastra. So our head, Professor Mangesh Kulkarni, he does not agree with my translation as usual. He said it should be Janakendri Rajyashastra. But I think the authentic translation can be done after Professor Partha Chatterjee's lecture so that we would be able to grasp the spirit of vernacular political science. I thank Professor Kulkarni for giving me this wonderful opportunity to introduce towering personality of Path Chatterjee. With these words, it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Chatterjee to deliver his talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And my greetings to all of you who have joined this event. I am particularly grateful to Mangesh for inviting me to give this lecture. In fact, he had first asked me several months ago, but of course, with these very unusual circumstances of the pandemic and lockdown and so on, I must say it completely slipped my mind until he reminded me, I think sometime in January, that I had made a promise. And so, of course, I was very, very grateful that he reminded me. And so here I am. I have a few things to say. It's a kind of proposal, but I will explain it to you in a few minutes. Let me first say that I had actually met Professor Sirsikar a couple of times, I think, at the annual conferences of the Indian Political Science Association sometime in the 1970s. Those days, of course, as you will realize, I was a very young scholar, just entering the discipline. And so I did attend some 4 or 5 Indian Political Science Association conferences in the 1970s. And I think I met him a couple of times, and I think I even heard him give a paper or a lecture at one of them. I'm sure he didn't remember me, but I was aware of his writings, particularly his books on electoral behavior. I will mention that in a few minutes. But let me say why it was important. As Mangesh reminded us, he was known in particular for introducing. He was one of the pioneers, we might say, of the so-called behavioral approach to political science. In fact, behaviorism was introduced, especially in American social sciences, in a range of disciplines, especially in the 1950s, and political science was one of them. Professor Sirsikar was one of the pioneers in using that method in the Indian, especially in Indian political science. Now, in a sense, it was something that was very new in political science. I'll give you a story from my student days when I was a student of political science in Calcutta at Presidency College in Calcutta in the 1960s. And I remember one of my teachers asked me to write an essay on caste in Indian politics. And he suggested 2 books. One was, I still remember, it was the collection called Village India, edited by McKim Marriott. At that time, that collection had just appeared in what was then the Economic Weekly. It later, of course, became the Economic and Political Weekly. It was a collection of essentially village studies of contemporary India in different, done by several scholars. And it later became a very important, almost like a classic book of what was later widely known as the village studies approach. So that was the one book. And the other book was Social Change in Modern India by M.N. Srinivas. That book also had only recently appeared. So I read those books, and I must say, as a student of political science, I was completely confused. Confused because there was a lot of new material about how politics and social relations actually existed in different rural areas of India. And a lot of this was completely new to me. But more confusing was that there was nothing in the political science which I had studied in college, which actually equipped me to make any sense of this material. Because the only things we studied in political science in the 1960s was political theory or political thought and constitutional history or constitutional theory. Those were the only two fields that were taught. Our only introduction to the field of contemporary India was a study of the Indian Constitution. There was nothing else that was actually taught. So this material on caste, I mean, I must have written something, but I don't have that essay anymore. So, but I'm sure it was a completely confused piece of writing because there was nothing that equipped me to make any sense of what I was reading in these two books. But I mean, I'm saying this simply to remind you of how new Professor Sirsikar's work must have been in the field of political science when he first published. So I just because I was preparing to give this lecture, I actually looked up some of these books once more. And so, for instance, Political Behavior in India, which was published in 1965, as Mangesh just mentioned, this was a case study, a survey based on a field survey of Pune parliamentary constituency, and it was using the random sample method of picking voters and interviewing them on the basis of a set questionnaire, the usual survey method. And one of his key findings there in that book was that most voters, and don't forget, this is 1962 elections, so that most voters did not know the issues of in the election, and many did not even know the candidates for whom they voted. Most voted according to instructions of caste or community leaders. Now, this was the general finding in 1962. Now, of course, as you will understand, that this is not something you will ever guess by simply reading the Indian Constitution, which of course says that every adult Indian has the right to vote. But how people actually vote was not something that was ever, that question was never raised in the classes of political science. His second book, Sovereign Without Crowns, Behavioral Analysis of the Indian Electoral Process, which was published in '73. This was again a resurvey of Pune parliamentary constituency, and this is for the 1967 elections. And his findings were interesting, and again, we can compare this with what the situation is today. So his findings for 1967 were that there was a very weak party structure, in the sense that party leaders and the organization was extremely weakly connected. Second, there was a very weak class formation. The classes were not very distinctly formed, but there was a very strong caste structure, and everybody knew which caste he or she belonged and what were the relations with other castes. There was little influence of the press. The main emotional issue, and this is interesting, this is 1967, mind you. The most emotional issue was of language. And of course, you will remember this was the period when the linguistic states were being formed. The whole controversy of the division between Gujarat and Maharashtra had just happened. There was a huge demand for the integration of all the Marathi-speaking districts in Madhya Pradesh. I think the Belgaum district controversy with Mysore was still on. It had still not been resolved. So language was an extremely emotional issue, and everybody seemed to be aware of that. Minorities, and this was one of the findings, minorities vote for the party in power, that minorities do not vote for opposition parties. Peripheral groups vote as a community. In other words, what we would call block voting. Women vote like the men in their family. There was no such thing as a distinctive women's vote. State-wise voting patterns, and this is very interesting, state-wise voting patterns are more reliable than all India patterns. In fact, Professor Sirsikar says that it is impossible to think of an average all India voter. It was possible to think of an average Maharashtrian voter, but not an all India, an average all India voter, because there was no general pattern of voting behavior that would hold for all over India. The Politics of Modern Maharashtra, this was a book I think he must have written after he had retired. This was published 1995. And that is, of course, much more. I've also looked at that book recently. It's a book, essentially the emergence of Maharashtra in the 20th century, and more in this period of after the formation of the linguistic state. Now, the behavioral approach, of course, as I said, this was Professor Sirsikar's method, has been criticized for its somewhat mechanical empiricism. It was extremely empirically grounded, and for its disinterest in the normative dimensions of political life. So this was not an approach which was particularly concerned with what should be the right way or of a good way of political life. It was not particularly concerned with ethical standards or normative standards in politics. It was much more concerned with how politics actually operates. And it's often been criticized because this kind of empiricism, it was often called a narrowly empiricist kind of method. But I think it accomplished a very significant move in turning the attention of Indian political scientists to the ground realities of politics. As I said, imagine a young student of political science in the 1960s who, if reading an account of how politics actually operates in a village, that student was simply unable to make any sense of that evidence in terms of what one had been taught as political concepts, the principles of political science, and so on. So therefore, there was something that behaviorism or this approach did accomplish in terms of drawing the attention of political scientists to precisely the ground realities of political life. Political scientists were urged to put aside the great books of Western political theory and take seriously the way political actors thought and spoke, actual political actors on the ground. How did they think? How did they speak? And how do they act? And it was very clear, as you can see from some of these findings that Professor Sirsikar had drawn our attention to, that the political actors on the ground had no sense of, just a minute, that they had no sense of, what Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau may have written. I mean, this was not part of the way in which ordinary people thought of politics. And so how was this huge divide to be bridged? And I think behaviorism did accomplish one very important thing, which was to draw the attention of political scientists in India to what they had completely neglected. Okay, now, Professor Sirsikar, as I said, was a pioneer in this move. It was an important first step towards what I will describe soon as a vernacular political science. This, I think, was an important first step, and Professor Sirsikar was a pioneer. Now, until the 1960s, political science in India consisted of Western, largely British liberal political thought. That was one of the a substantial part of what was taught as political science, British liberal thought, and British constitutional legal theory. British constitutional legal theory. The American legal theory or European legal theories or constitutional theories were much less important. Now, to some extent, this was not irrelevant. This emphasis on British political thought, liberal thought, and British constitutional theory. It was not irrelevant because, as we know, the state structure which we had inherited from colonial times had been shaped within those traditions. We know this. So the new Indian constitution was explicitly based on liberal democratic principles. And it also retained large parts of the structure created by the 1935 constitutional reforms, right? A very large part, and we all know this, students of the Constitution will know this, that a large part of the present Indian Constitution was actually directly lifted from the 1935 Act. Now, the entire colonial, more than that, more than just the Constitution, the entire colonial legal and judicial structure was retained. So the courts, the high courts, the entire body of law from the colonial times. The only thing that was added was a Supreme Court on top and fundamental rights, which of course earlier did not exist. But otherwise, the entire body of the Indian Penal Code, the Indian Civil Code, all of these were retained. And the entire body of precedents in the high courts was retained. Okay, so as far as the state structure itself was concerned, the tradition of British liberal and constitutional theory was still perfectly relevant to India. And so there was some justification in making that a major part of what was studied in political science. But the turn to behavioral empiricism was carried forward not so much in political science, but in a field that came to be called political sociology. Mangesh just mentioned this. Political sociology, to distinguish it from traditional political science. This is interesting because, as I said, the content was different and there was some resistance, I think, among the older political scientists to actually welcome this as a legitimate part of political science. So in fact, the name political sociology was preferred to suggest that somehow it is closer to sociology than to political science. Okay, so it came to be called political sociology. The crucial topics that were tackled in this new field called political sociology were especially the power structure in rural society, dominant castes, that became a very major area of study, political elites, mobilization of votes by parties. These were some of the main things that were studied. Two broad methods emerged in political sociology. One was the random survey of voters and households, right? This is what I just described. Professor Sirsikar was followed essentially this kind of method. This culminated, this particular method of samples survey culminated in what came to be called election studies. following the lead given in the 1960s by American political scientists, such as Richard Park, for instance. A group led by Rajni Kothari, and of course, many distinguished colleagues of Professor Kothari, Ashish Nandi, Bashiruddin Ahmed, Dhirubhai Seth, and others, they formed CSDS in Delhi as the leading center of election studies in India. This was the culmination of the behavioral science, which specifically adopted the method of sample survey of voters as its method. The other method, also in political sociology, was the ethnographic method of villages, village ethnography, in which social anthropologists took the lead. And this is where the Delhi School of Economics, the sociology department at Delhi School of Economics under Professor M.N. Srinivas, became the major center of village studies in India. To this day, these are the two broad streams of empirical study of Indian politics, which runs through the fields of sociology and anthropology. So political sociology going through essentially sociology and anthropology. As I said, that in neither of these fields, of course, election studies was the one that was particularly colonized by political scientists, but ethnography, village studies, always remained a field that was where it was the anthropologists, sociologists and anthropologists who were the leaders. In particular, and one of the things, of course, with village studies in particular, the uniqueness of caste as a social institution, which is not to be found anywhere else in the world, that gave to Indian political sociology a distinct content that cannot be found in general sociology. So in a sense, one of the greatest claims of Indian political sociology was that we have to deal with caste, and caste is not something that exists in quite this institutional form anywhere else. And therefore, we are the ones who are legitimately the experts in this field. This is a distinct discipline because it cannot be done in quite this way using the methods that are followed elsewhere in the world. So it requires a uniquely Indian approach. Caste was the reason for this. Now, so this is what I have described as the turn to empirical field observations, where behaviorism became an early approach. But there was a different attempt also, which was not quite like this. This was the attempt by political scientists, Indian political scientists, to find a distinctly Indian content in Indian political thought. Now that's a different approach altogether. Indian political thought. And there were two streams here. There was the ancient and there was the modern. And this is where historians took the lead, especially for the ancient part, but also the modern. I'll come to this in a minute. Historians led the study of ancient Indian polities. So these were kingdoms as well as the so-called republican polities, the Gana polities. And alongside, there was the study of the principles of statecraft called Niti or Rajadharma, right, which is compiled within the broader Dharmashastra tradition. And especially the discovery of the Kautilya Arthashastra in the early 20th century, if I'm not mistaken, 1905 is when the first full text of the Kautilya Arthashastra was found by Shama Shastri in Mysore. And of course that provided a boost to this branch of scholarship, because for the first time, there was a full treatise on what could be called politics, which was from ancient India. And of course, as you know, very often Kautilya was compared to Machiavelli and so on. So it is almost like an ancient great thinker on politics. So this field of ancient Indian political thought did get a lot of boost in the 20th century. There was also an attempt by some historians to trace a distinctly Indian version of Islamic political theory. So the argument often was that Islamic political theory was not simply brought over from Arabic or Persian sources, but through its practice in India, it acquired a distinctly Indian form, because a whole range of Indian institutions and Indian practices had to be incorporated. And so there was some attempt to do this as well. Now the difficulty for political science, so I'm talking of ancient Indian political thought. The difficulty for political science was to establish the relevance of ancient thought for contemporary Indian politics, both normatively and empirically. What was the relevance of ancient Indian political thought? Because how could ancient thought be made relevant to a republic based on popular sovereignty and the fundamental rights of liberty and equality? Because none of these things were true of any kind of ancient thought. There was no modern republic based on popular sovereignty. So the Gana formations too, there was no conception of what we will recognize as popular sovereignty there. And of course, kingship based on the relation between the king and the praja or the subjects, that is not something that is relevant to the modern constitutional form that India has adopted. There was also clearly the huge impact of the entire Varnashram formation into every aspect of the application of power in society. The law as well. I mean, it was not even that the king made laws. The laws were already there. The laws existed in the form of the Dharma Shastras. And it was the duty of Brahmins to adjudicate between different interpretations of the Dharma Shastra. And the king was supposed to follow what was already the law, which existed. So in a sense, how could this kind of political structure of thought be relevant to the kind of political formation or the kind of political process and the institutions that had been adopted in modern India through the Indian Constitution? And that became a major problem. How is ancient thought to be made relevant to the modern practices of Indian politics? So that raised the issue of what is modern Indian political thought then? Isn't this something that Indian political thinkers had faced? How could traditional understandings of politics and power be made relevant in the modern context? So that would presumably be the content of modern Indian political thought. Now, here again, what happened was that the study of modern Indian political thought followed the Western tradition of analyzing canonical thinkers, the great thinkers model, which is how Western political thought is still, broadly speaking, organized. You have the canonical thinkers from Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau onwards. Okay. So one of the earliest in this, works that set this pattern was B.B. Majumdar, Biman Bihari Majumdar at Patna University. who began the trend with the history of Indian political ideas, and it was called From Ram Mohan to Dayanand. So it was through the 19th century. This book was first published in 1934, and there was a later revised edition in 67. It was very widely read. And then this was followed soon by Vishwanath Prasad Verma, VP Verma, which again, when I used to be, I first began teaching political science, this was easily the most widely read book on modern Indian political. It was called Modern Indian Political Thought. And it went like this. Basically, the chapters went like Ram Mohan, then you had the moderates and extremists in the Congress, then you had Gandhi, then you had Hindu revivalism, then you had Muslim political thought, Nehru, Bose, socialist thought. So in a sense, you still have these sort of great thinkers. You still had the great thinkers kind of tradition that's being followed. Now, here the difficulty, it still remains, of establishing a body of canonical thought that is sufficiently rigorous and analytical, and which could be discussed in terms of certain key political concepts. And this became a major problem, because you think of something like, moderates and extremists, and you think of people like, Gokhale, Ranade, from the moderates. You think of Tilak, so-called extremists, or Bipin Pal, or Lajpat Rai, and so on. But none of these people were really political theorists, right? They very seldom wrote any rigorously argued treatise on politics. So all of this had to be constructed, as it were, some kind of from a wide variety of writings, sometimes only very short articles, sometimes speeches and so on. And then you have to extract a kind of theoretical body of thought from out of those material. And the difficulty always was that how could such a canon of body of canonical thought be established, which would actually speak to one another? In other words, create a kind of discourse to which everybody had to relate. Was there such a thing? Even for Gandhi, who of course remains even today probably the most widely studied, and I have to say deeply studied modern thinker in India. But Gandhi, as we know, there was no political treatise that he ever wrote. And he was undoubtedly highly original in his thinking. But the absence of a rigorously argued treatise can only be made up by an original construction of how Gandhi might be read as a rigorous thinker. And many people, very distinguished scholars have done this, and some of them are truly exceptional books. Many of them have tried to do this. But each of them were, as it were, readings of Gandhi into something like a rigorous, how would Gandhi look like if we were to construct a rigorous body of thought out of the various things that he had said. So that became the main way of approaching this subject. In fact, if you ask me, in that sense, apart from, I would say, just three distinguished modern thinkers, Muhammad Iqbal, M.N. Roy, and Ambedkar. These are the three I would suggest actually have rigorously argued treatises on political topics. And they could be discussed in the way in which political theory can be discussed. But the difficulty there too is that none of them actually speak to one another. Iqbal doesn't speak to M.N. Roy. M.N. Roy doesn't speak to Ambedkar. So they don't form a connected field of concepts within which these theory or thinkers could be discussed. They are not part of a distinct distinct discursive tradition. And so that remains the difficulty with ancient political thought, Indian political thought, as well as modern Indian political thought as disciplines of to produce an Indian political science. So we don't actually have an Indian political science in the sense in which we have an Indian sociology, right? And this is the first major point that I want to establish and then move on from there. Professor Sirsikar highlighted the fact that whereas it was possible to find patterns of political behavior at the level of the linguistic state, it was impossible to do so for India as a whole. And the reason is that cultural formations at the level of the people are formed around language. Professor Sirsikar was very aware, even from his own surveys, how important language was in terms of the way in which people thought of, understood, and articulated various issues in politics. So Professor Sirsikar found that in 1967, language was the most emotive issue in Pune. The struggle for linguistic states was, of course, still on. And don't forget that this struggle for linguistic states actually began with the Congress decision in 1919 to reorganize all its provincial committees and use regional languages. So if you remember, in 1919-20, the Congress decided to adopt the regional languages as the language of political communication. Until then, the Congress leaders only met once a year. And of course, all the speeches were in English, all the resolutions were in English. The Congress decided that they would not do this because, of course, to turn the the freedom movement into a mass movement, you would have to communicate in the mother tongue of people. And so what they decided was, this was in a sense a radical decision, was to reorganize the Congress provincial committees on linguistic lines, disregarding the administrative division of the provinces. So for instance, you had a Gujarat PCC, even though there was no Gujarat province. Gujarat was part of Bombay province. There was a Kerala Pradesh Congress Committee. There was an Andhra Pradesh Congress Committee, even though there was no such thing as an Andhra province. So all of these were decisions, major decisions taken way back in 1920. Now, democratic politics has since widened and deepened through communication in the various regional languages. Political scientists have not been sufficiently attentive to political ideas that circulate in Indian languages and to turn them into concepts. Now, this is one of the key elements of what I am suggesting would be a vernacular political science. To be attentive to political ideas that circulate in Indian languages and to turn them into concepts. Contrast this with social anthropology, where village ethnography has produced a completely new conceptual form of the jati. So of course, caste or jati, that is a very core concept in Indian sociology. But through the village ethnographies, what emerged was the variety of jati formations in India, which was not bound by the Dharma Shastra tradition, right? The contrast I would draw is from the tradition of a Ghuriye or Iravati Karve earlier, who of course wrote a great deal on caste, but caste for them was still bound very much within the Varnashram formation as defined by the texts of the Dharma Shastra. Village ethnography was the one which exploded that whole understanding of caste to say that that is not how caste actually operates. In lots of places, as we know very well, that jati structures actually change almost from district to district, from region to region. They are not the same. The same caste may be in one kind of hierarchical position in one place and a different position in another district, right? Not only that, the position of jatis also move up and down because of changes in the economic situation, the political situation. Now, none of this is understood within the textual tradition, okay? But this is what village ethnography actually was able to do. Social anthropologists were able to produce the relevant concepts for understanding this. And they were able to do this, of course, through enormously laborious and detailed village ethnographies, which were carried out by all of these groups of scholars, some of them great ones, and their students and so on and so forth. Now, there is no corresponding effort within the discipline of Indian political science. I cannot think of a similar effort in Indian political science. For example, and now I'm simply giving you certain examples because obviously this is not, I don't have a vernacular political science to offer you. But I'm suggesting out of various examples what it might look like, what kind of problems could be posed. For example, the word for nation is one we will all accept. It's one of the key concepts, key words which fly around in Indian politics all the time, okay? Now, the word for nation in many Indian languages, including Hindi, Marathi, and Gujarati, the word is Rashtra. But in Bangla, the word for nation is Jati. In Assamese, Odia, the word is Desh. That is nation. In Kannada, Desam. In Tamil, Desam. Take the word the state. Again, a very key concept. The Hindi, Kannada, or Malayalam word is Rajya for state. In Bangla, it is Rashtra. Now, in Telugu, Rashtram. In Tamil, Arasu or Manilam. Each of these words have a different conceptual history. Yet, they are also, in some sense, located within the discourse of Indian politics. So the question would be, is there a translation that goes on in these transactions between the regional and the all India formations, right? How are these concepts? They are all concepts. Everybody understands what nation means, and yet in different languages, the words are different. Sometimes the same word is used in a very, very different sense in a neighboring language. Now, how are these transactions actually taking place? If you simply say that, oh, this means nation and this means state, and then you fall back upon our English understanding of what these words mean, we will be missing the conceptual history, the rich conceptual history of each of these terms as they are available in that regional language, right? Because as we all know, the more widespread and the more widely used a concept, the richer the possibilities of its of ambiguities of meaning, the way in which meanings can be, people play upon the meaning of words, right? And that is the conceptual richness of a language. And each of these words, for instance, the word jati, the word rashtra, the word rajya, they can be made to mean a whole range of things. People do a lot of things with these kinds of words as concepts. And yet we will be missing out on the rich conceptual history in each of these languages that are attached to words like this. So let me also point out that common political words, they change their meanings over time. Now, for instance, I'll give you an example. In Bangla, the most common word used in political context to mean the people in the colonial period was praja. Praja was the word which would most ordinarily be used to mean the people. Now, this implied the long familiar relation between Raja and Praja. And the understanding was that there were Rajas, rulers, and the people or the ordinary people were Praja or subjects. Now, the word for republic in Bangla is Prajatantra. It's the same in Hindi. It's the same in many Indian languages, which implies now, it's very interesting, Prajatantra means an overturning of the traditional relationship between Raja and Praja, because it means that the Praja are now the rulers. That is Prajatantra. That meaning is attached to the word republic. It's extremely significant, but of course, ordinarily, if you ask a person, this would not strike somebody. But these are inherent political meanings, right? That come with the conceptual richness of a language, and we would miss this unless we actually thought of these terms. These are, as I'm suggesting, vernacular terms. Okay. Now, I was struck by the conceptual use of this word, praja. I was looking at this, I just came across this book. It's a school textbook, 1878 school textbook, which described the rights of citizens as praja swatta. And the general will, and it was clearly an attempt to explain Rousseau's general will for school children. This was at the matriculation level book. And the general will was explained as the exercise of Praja Shakti. But Praja, now all of this, as I said, in 1878, the word Praja would have carried the standard meaning of subjects of a Raja. Okay, so Praja Shakti, Praja Swatta have particular meanings attached to them in that context. Today, Praja is no longer used to mean the people. That word has gone out of circulation. Today, words like Jana or Gana or Janagan, they have taken their place. In Hindi, the most common word now would be Janta or Lok to mean the people. Sometimes, so I'm suggesting that these are histories of key conceptual terms in the various regional languages. They all have, these histories have a particular conceptual load, a particular conceptual richness, which should not be lost sight of, because ordinary people using the ordinary regional language to make sense of political issues, these are the words and the ideas that are connoted by these words that circulate in the public arena. Okay. Sometimes commonly used words can become technical terms. They don't have any ordinary meaning anymore. They are only acquire a technical meaning. So again, I mean, because Bangla is the language I know most deeply, the term for scheduled castes in Bangla is Tafsili Jati. Tafsili Jati. Now, its origin is from the 1935 Act. That's, of course, the first time that the schedule was produced and scheduled castes was defined for the first time, 1935. Okay, and the Bangla translation of the 1935 Act used the word tafsil. It's a Persian word, tafsil, which meant list, right? That's the schedule. And tafsil was a term which was used it's a Persian bureaucratic term. It was used in legal language. And that's the translation that was used in 1935. Even to this day in Bangla, the term for scheduled caste or scheduled tribe is Tafsili Jati. Nobody knows what Tafsili means. That word has completely gone out of, nobody knows anymore where that word comes from, that it was originally a Farsi word. Many people actually think it's a Sanskrit word, some word, and so they call it Toposhili to make it sound like more Sanskrit, but it's Tafsili. Now, and that is only a technical term. That word is not used for any other context except to mean scheduled caste or scheduled tribe. So these are the conceptual histories of terms. Now, it's interesting, what is the implication for the understanding of caste, or for the understanding of the place of the, what are officially called scheduled castes, to call them Toposhili? Because that's a word that has no other sense except for this particular one. Very interesting then. So, vernacular concepts, what I'm suggesting, they are neither purely indigenous, nor are they always derived from textual sources. Okay, they have multiple sources, they have unpredictable patterns of circulation and are changeable. Ethnographic studies do often pay attention to such vernacular concept formations in their local circulation. But there are few attempts to connect them to a larger conceptual field in order to gain some theoretical purchase. Often the response is, this is the way it is in my village, and leave it at that. To take that next step, it would be necessary to put the results of many local ethnographies side by side and discover patterns. It requires teamwork of the kind that social anthropologists were able to accomplish in the 1960s, 1970s. Ethnographic studies and survey research, as we all know, they are also expensive and require funding to carry out survey research. You have to employ research assistants and so on. You require leave from teaching in order to do this. You have to travel to a particular field, stay there. Ethnographic studies in particular, you have to stay in a particular place for a length of time in order to be able to capture the richness of that local culture. So all of these are the difficulties that have, I think, prevented Indian political science from doing the sort of thing that, for instance, people like Srinivas and Andre Bete and so on were able to do in the 50s and 60s, because in a sense, of course, they took the lead. They were able to organize. I remember there's a famous thing about Srinivas actually fighting with the UGC to say that in sociology, you must allow a young professor, a young assistant professor, lecturer, you have to allow 6 months leave in order for that person to carry out fieldwork. This was unheard of, but it was done in Delhi school. This was a system. So these were, of course, questions of institutional leadership. That sort of thing is hard to accomplish within the bureaucratic structure that we now have in Indian universities. So there are reasons why the sort of thing that I'm suggesting did not quite happen. And so the fallback upon the textual is in some ways an easier solution, a more practical solution, because it's easier to do the textual work. You can sit in your office or at home, or just go to visit a library from time to time, and you can do that kind of work. Field ethnography requires a very different kind of allocation of research time. So, but I have one final proposal here. which is that new technologies of communication have opened up new opportunities for this kind of research into vernacular concepts. Social media outlets have emerged as a major public forum for the expression of political opinion by a whole range of groups and classes. They provide a huge mass of textualized speech that reveal the formation and circulation of vernacular political ideas at popular levels that are not captured in books, periodicals, and newspapers. And I mean both the things that are appear in text form, as well as the huge circulation of videos and so on, from all sorts of places by almost anybody. And that is available on social media. Now, new techniques developed by the digital humanities, which of course is a whole new field with completely new kinds of techniques that are emerging precisely for the study of this sort of material, okay, digital humanities. New techniques developed by the digital humanities could be used by political scientists to analyze this huge material to identify key concepts that shape popular political opinion and practice. Vernacular political science is not to separate ideas of indigenous origin from the foreign. Because as I said, that all of those things are completely mixed up. If you look at social media, what circulates, it will be very difficult to separate what is truly indigenous from what is foreign. All of these things are mixed up there. So it's in fact, the project is not to separate indigenous from foreign, nor is it somehow to decolonize Indian political practice. Even there, for instance, what has emerged, what has come to us from the colonial has so completely seeped into practices and thinking that it's I think futile to say, well, let's get rid of all of those things that come from the colonial period. It's not practical. It will in fact make the vernacular language in circulation a poorer language. All right. Historical processes that have woven foreign and pan-Indian ideas into the provincial and the local, they have all become part of what is the provincial and the local. They have entered the ordinary language of people. That is where the project of vernacular political science must be located. It has been attempted, but only in a piecemeal manner. As I said, that from the time of Professor Sirsikar on through what emerged as political sociology, these kinds of things have been attempted, okay? But my sense is that it's been attempted only in a piecemeal manner and rather unself-consciously. That is the project that I am asking younger political scientists to formulate and carry out. It will need collaboration across linguistic regions. But that is how social anthropologists worked in the 1960s and 70s. An effort of that kind is required. So that's my case for a vernacular political science, and I would be most happy to hear your responses and questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee. That was a very stimulating lecture. Though I must say, I thought that you would probably be using the term vernacular in a slightly broader sense, but the way you used it is actually closer to what Shiranjan had in mind, which is actually the regional languages and but perhaps sort of political life world that they embody or express. It also reminds me of another kind of project, very much a European project. And that was, as you know, Reinhard Koselleck and his colleagues carried out through the 70s and beyond. That's called Begriffsgeschichte. or conceptual history, but that was, I think, somehow more oriented towards texts, though of a different kind, thesauri, encyclopedias, archives of newspapers and periodicals and things like that. And of course, it's more of a unilingual situation that they are looking at. I think they were looking mainly at German language texts, but they were also, I think, trying to map, and also, of course, it had a clear historical dimension in the sense that they were trying to map this transformation from, let's say, so I mean, the how a certain kind of a modern vocabulary gets formed, I think, and what sort of a new life word it expresses, etc., etc. But I do, I mean, I think most of us have grasped the essential thrust of your lecture, and surely, as you said, younger political scientists will definitely take inspiration from what you have said, and especially those who know the regional languages well. And are open to doing this kind of research. Some of them, indeed, Shiranjan himself, for example, is looking at the role of social media. And as you said, that also has its own set of, it creates its own vocabulary. It also, finally, I just want to quickly say that even in English, we have a set of terms which are somehow, they have some, or they have their origins in our own realities and reflections on those political realities, such as, for example, the license permit quota Raj, those kinds of terms, or even look at the way, I mean, we all know how the term pseudo-secular, for example, has gained a certain kind of currency and has become normalized, and it's become part of a certain kind of common sense in the Gramscian sense. So there are these terms, apart from terms like kham and so on, ajigar, these sorts of social combines that have always played an important role in Indian politics. So there is a whole world out there that needs to be explored. You would surely recall this way back. Maurice Jones, in his the well-known text on Indian politics, had already talked about idioms of Indian politics. In another sense, that is traditional, modern, and the saintly idiom also, which you even now hear. Sometimes when I listen to Yogendra Yadav, I hear echoes of that saintly idiom even. So anyway, so there is this whole world out there that needs to be explored. So may I now hand over to Shiranjan again. Shiranjan, can you please take over? I mean, on my own behalf, I thank Parthoda once again from the bottom of my heart for accepting our invitation and for this excellent presentation. And I hand over once again to Shiranjan. Yeah, Shiranjan, can you take over? We can't hear you.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Parthoda, can you hear Shiranjan? He has probably muted.
I can hear Mangesh, but I can't hear Sriranjan.
See, that's the problem. So why don't you?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello, sir. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Through this.
Okay. Hello. Are there questions or responses? Hello. Yes, Muzaffar. Please ask. Muzaffar has raised his hand. Muzaffar. Muzaffar, you can. Okay, you have to unmute. Yes, I have unmuted you.
Yeah. Hi. Hello, Professor Partha Chatterjee. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes. You are.
Yeah, so thank you very much for this very illuminating lecture. So I'm not a political scientist by any means. I teach philosophy. So and I have heard you multiple times, and I have read you. So it's again a privilege to hear you. My question is related to like at one point of time while I was listening to this lecture, I was reminded of Bhikkhu Parekh when he wrote this monumental, I'll call it monumental essay, because we are still with that problem, the poverty of Indian political theory. So at one point of time, it seemed to me that you're also sounding very much and trying to like push further the same debate. But I'll just like want to ask this question. Do you think that the vernacularization of Indian political science has a lack or is not being properly done, because within political science there is to some extent a gap between how political science is done and how political theory operates? Because at one point of time you just said that by vernacular political science you mean that one has to be attentive to the Indian political ideas that need to be conceptualized, because conceptualization is important. Even if vernacular language comes in, again, for that, you may need translations because India is a community of communities. Okay. So do you think rather than it being like usually it's pushed down to the political scientist, whereas it may be the case that we are doing a Rillian category mistake, and it is more proper to go after the political theorist who has still now been in a slumber, in a human slumber, and usually maybe to some extent political philosophy as well. Maybe in India, what lacks is that there has not been a proper way or a proper initiation into conceptualization or theorization, but rather political science has been taken as a scientific or a naturalistic discipline. That's it. Thank you.
Uh, Professor Chatterjee, would you like to answer right away, or should we take multiple questions?
This is what I was going to ask you. Is it better to pool a few questions and then answer?
Okay. So Kedar Naik has some question. I will unmute him. Kedar, now you can speak.
So, yeah. Thank you, Srinjan.
Yes.
So it was you, Professor Chatterjee. So my question is regarding your book, Politics of Government, and how do we situate the politics of government? So, like you say that the whole Indian politics since independence has been the effort on the part of elites to silence the cultural non-elite politics. And if you see the creation or the very creation of the concepts by the elites, so it were the elites who were creating the vernacular concept to oppose the Raj. So how do we look at the layers which are present in this vernacular? So we cannot see one layer of vernacular. Vernacular has layers in itself, and so how do we deal with such kind of layers? Another problem with the vernacularization is that, so your language is essentially related to your community, and when we try to like vernacularize something, it may reflect upon the so vernacularization might result into the communalization, and then how do we deal with it? And the third aspect is that it is quite a provocative question. So I fail to understand the essentialism of the vernacularization. So if the modernity and the say equity, not even the equality, is essentially if it is 18th century, 19th century European concept, and then so even when we look at the behavioralism, and then Professor Gopal Guru has done some amazing work, and when he says that in behavioralism, when it comes to India, it is like a liberating practice. So we have the theoretical Brahmins and empresses Shudras That's the kind of thing that he told, said, or observed in his studies. So what I'm saying, so if the equity of the 19th century, if the Indian populace at large finds the 19th century European concepts liberating, then why do we need to turn towards vernacularization? So thank you again. Thank you for the opportunity for positing such questions.
I think now you have question bank, sir.
Okay, thank you. In fact,
Professor, yeah. Yes.
so let me respond. Well, first, Mangesh raised this question of the relation between of the vernacular and also the place of what you might call Indian English, and I think that gives me an opportunity to actually clarify what I mean by the vernacular, and if I could make the comparison with the rise of modern political theory in Europe. You see, because in Europe, there was a classical vernacular contrast, and the classical was Latin, and the vernacular were precisely what we now know as the modern European languages. These were known as the vernacular. And if you go back to, Machiavelli, of course, wrote in Italian, and that was considered, a real departure. But many of the early classics, including Hobbes, for instance, wrote several books in Latin, and that was considered the scholarly language. So anybody who had any scholarly pretensions would write in Latin. One of the crucial transformations that takes place in the 16th, 17th century is that leading theorists move away from the Latin, the classical, into writing in the vernacular. Okay, and Hobbes is a very interesting example because he wrote both in Latin as well as in English. Now, you'll get the same in France, you get the same in Germany, and that became the relation between the classical and the vernacular. And of course, once the vernacular or the European languages become accepted as a place where scholarly, philosophical, theoretical work can be done as acceptable languages for doing that work, then nobody, today there is not a single person who would say, if you have to write a scholarly book, write it in Latin. Nobody does it. Okay. Now, in the Indian case, the very interesting contrast is this, that for a long time, there was a distinction between the classical and the vernacular, between Sanskrit and all the so-called, Desi, Prakrit, whatever you want to call it, the languages. In the Islamic tradition, you had Arabic and Persian and the various Indian languages. Now, the most interesting thing that happens with the British colonial period is that English also comes to be recognized as a kind of classical language, in contrast to the Indian languages, which are the vernaculars. This word is no longer used. For instance, when I went to school in the 1950s, English and vernacular were subjects. So you had English and the vernacular was whatever Indian languages you were studying. That was called the vernacular. Okay. Now, this is the terminology that was current in the colonial period. So English became a kind of classical language. And this is true even today among all of you, anyone who has any scholarly pretensions must write in English. That is the accepted language of scholarly writing in India. Okay, now this is a very different situation from the European one. In Europe, what used to be vernacular is now the accepted scholarly language. So, people writing in Germany, the German books get translated into French, into English, into Italian. Everybody, there is a common kind of Italian European pool of languages where there is constant translation. And of course, many people are familiar, they can read several European languages. And so that is the discursive field of Western political theory or Western political thought, where all of these European languages, they feed into a single discursive field. In the Indian case, the difficulty is that the single field is constituted by English, right? At the moment, it is constituted in the English language. The Indian languages feed. Yes, there, for instance, if you have to do a survey, you would have to translate your questionnaire into Marathi or Tamil or whatever it is in order to carry out that survey. But, and this is the most interesting problem, and I can raise this question in relation to Kedar's question, what he was asking. In a sense, what you would have to do if you take the lesson from the field surveys, the ethnographies of the anthropologists, you have to collect your material, you have to carry out the survey, carry out the inquiry in the regional language, but you have to conceptualize in English. Now, that is the disciplinary situation in which we are in. This is both productive as well as there is a limitation there. It is productive because it will force you to do the translation work. In other words, it will have to, this is the kind of thing that social anthropologists had to do when they were looking into jati structures. And the jati was described in local languages wherever they went, right? They then were forced into communicating with people. So somebody did fieldwork in a Tamil region, someone was doing a fieldwork in a Marathi village, someone was doing it in Punjab. But all of them, when they come together with their findings and make it available to others, they have to do the conceptual work and produce a text, their scholarly work in English. And that constituted the common pool of the anthropologists, the field of social anthropology in India. Okay, and that is the way in which the conceptualizing had to be done. You had to have a certain kind of abstraction in order to be able to put it in. Sometimes they were not using the European term at all. So for instance, they would use caste, but what they would mean is jati, which is not exactly caste, right? And there would be very specific definitions of what jati would mean. And there are many, many other words which come from particular specific languages, but which acquire a conceptual form within the field of social anthropology as carried out in the English language. Now, in the Indian case, I think this has an advantage because it forces, as I said, it forces one to do the conceptualization or to do the work of abstraction in order to translate. It also has a limitation, which is, of course, every time you do it, you create a distance between the linguistic formation that you were studying and your own scholarly language. So is there a feedback? Can the conceptualization you are doing work backwards into the field? And if I think of what's happened in anthropology, my understanding would be that the scholarly work that anthropologists were able to do, right, which make the phenomenon of caste so much more understandable for people like us who read these works in English, right? They make it far more understandable for us. But I don't think it flows back into, so if you ask somebody in a Maharashtra village about caste, they would still continue to think of it in the older terms of whatever is in circulation, with absolutely no feedback or input from what anthropologists may have discovered. That does not work backwards. Okay, and that is the limitation. And I think the only way in which this could be done is if political scientists or anthropologists or social scientists generally would actually be bilingual writers, write both in English as well as in the regional language. But that's one further step in the production of a vernacular political science. So that's the contrast between with Europe. I think that's particularly relevant in our case. To come to one interesting question about Indian English, for instance, and how they have actually become vernacular. Take the term OBC. Now, OBC is an acronym, English acronym, obviously, standing for other backward classes. Very often in local, nobody knows other backward classes. They know OBC, and OBC is a Hindi word, a Marathi word today, right? How does that happen? And that is the very interesting kind of what I'm suggesting is the vernacular, in which even English terms or terms that come from English become completely vernacularized, as it were, in terms of its use in ordinary language. Muzaffar's question is particularly interesting, of how conceptualizing can be done through theory. What my response would be is sort of the kind of thing that the philosophy of ordinary language was trying to do in if you think of Anglo-American philosophy. The theory of ordinary language was an attempt to get away from what was the scholarly discipline of philosophizing, a body of essentially work or conceptual formations that had been done within the field of abstraction that the scholarly language had produced in philosophy, for instance. But to subject ordinary language to philosophical analysis and look at what the results might be, produced a very different kind of knowledge, you might say, about how concepts are formed, how concepts circulate in ordinary contexts, not scholarly contexts, ordinary contexts. In a sense, what I'm suggesting is something of that kind, that yes, even philosophers can engage in this particular exercise that I'm suggesting, which is to first observe patterns, linguistic patterns, rhetorical patterns, right, in the ordinary language, and then conceptualize, try and discover what are the conceptual operations going on in the way in which ordinary language circulates. And that would be sort of the exercise that I am proposing. Okay. Next. Sriranjan, you're again silent. We can't hear you.
Hello.
Yes.
Is there any other question?
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee.
Thank you, Professor Chatterjee. This was really an intellectual treat for all of us. And it's an eye-opener session. I thank all the participants and especially Kulkarni sir for organizing this lecture. So let's conclude the session. Thank you.
I say something.
Yes. How was it name? Hello, sir.
I am Sirsikar here. I just want
Yes,
to
sir. Please, please.
I
Yes,
just
sir.
want to thank Mr. Chatterjee. I am not a political science student, but I enjoyed listening to his lecture. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much for attending this session, sir. Thank you.